Intuition it's a way of harnessing the co-creative relational potential inherent in how we navigate the flow of these two different energetics. An intention is like harnessing the mental aspect as the archetype of the magician. Welcome to Secret Art of Space-Time, a podcast about ideas, culture, and spirituality. My name is Andy. I hope you enjoy this show. So, as usual, I want to speak to our current moment in time and how we might relate to it in a good way, but I want to try to simplify things a little bit. I want to speak to what I feel like is the most important thing. And whenever I do this, it's a way of trying to simplify things, but without reducing the complexity that exists. Today, I want to speak about intuition and how to align with our intuition and how I think that is perhaps the most important thing we can do in this moment. But of course, we can engage with any area of life intuitively, and our intuition may guide us towards an infinite number of possible actions. So I'm not trying to reduce the complexity that exists. I want us to have sort of a single point of focus that can still honor the variety and diversity and, all the different places that we find ourselves in. And I took a similar tactic in my New Year's episode. I think I called that episode Destiny Timeline. I'm not 100% sure, but I want to mention it because I think it's a really important episode and not as many people listen to that one. Maybe the title wasn't as resonant with people, but there was a similar sort of idea of like the most important thing, and that yet still encompasses literally infinite possibilities. So in that episode, I was talking about how the most important thing is aligning with our destiny or with our true frequency, with our true authentic being. And today I want to talk about something a little similar but a little different, which is intuition. And it sounds so simple and so easy, and yet it's not in practice for most of us anyway. It certainly isn't for me, even though, I work in this realm. My work is inherently intuitive, and yet I still struggle with it. And the struggle was especially prominent for me in the last couple months. I put out this episode in September about the eclipses, the Pisces Virgo eclipse series. And in that episode, I spoke about how I'm working on releasing perfectionism. And as these things sometimes work, I immediately after that had this huge upwelling of that particular shadow, of the perfectionist shadow. I mean, it's so funny how it works, right? Especially when we say something out loud. But even if it's just like a realization or an intention we set, so often we get another wave, right? Another opportunity for a deeper layer of healing. And healing works this way in waves, right? It's never complete. We never get to a place where we're like 100% healed or 100% awakened or whatever, right? It's a journey and it's a spiral and it's literally never ending. There's literally never ending opportunities for expansion, for evolution, for increasing our awareness. And at times it can even feel like we're moving backwards for a moment, right? We think we've worked through some pattern, and then, it comes to haunt us, or there's, another wave of whatever that pattern that we thought we'd healed from was that surfaces, right? And usually it's not that we're regressing, it's that, it's just this cycle, this spiraling cycle where we will receive another opportunity for release, for awareness, for healing. And as long as we relate to it in that way, that's what can happen, right? But so often we get this wave of that pattern, and for many of us, there can be a tendency to be afraid or frustrated or think we're going backwards, and then we repress it and push it down and deny it and fight it. And then we miss out on that opportunity for healing, right? So I received this huge wave of this pattern around perfectionism and self-doubt that kind of go hand in hand for me. And it really was this opportunity for refinement, because I kind of made this statement around, I'm releasing perfectionism. I'm trying to show up on this podcast in a way that feels, to me, sometimes a little bit more messy or less prepared or less perfect or whatever it is. But there's obviously, of course, another side of that coin, so to speak, which is that I still want to aspire to keep refining and improving and creating episodes that are, as high quality as I can make and are clear. And, I still aspire to quality, let's say, even while striving to release perfectionism. And so, of course, it can never just be like swinging to the other extreme and just, putting stuff out there that I'm not really happy with. And yet, I think because I made this statement, I'm releasing perfectionism, I was really struggling with it's not even a line. A part of me is what's the balance between perfectionism and quality? But it doesn't feel like so much a balance as a refinement around what it means to strive to create, quality episodes while releasing perfectionism. And this whole theme for me goes hand in hand with what I really want to talk about today, which is intuition and flow, the creative flow. And, as we talk about so often here, we really are in this huge shift, a global shift in every arena, right? And how we operate. And it's really important to me to show up in my work as best I can, to the extent I can, embodying what I see to be this new way. And it's not just one way, and it's not something we can sum up in a single word, but it's a new energetics, a new paradigm, right? And that refers to not just the content that we discuss, but of course, how we do what we do. And if I were to relate to this work in the old paradigm way, I would, have a strict schedule, and I would, have a list of topics, and I would show up every week, and I would record at a certain time, and, I would edit, and then I would publish on a very regular, probably weekly publication schedule. And there would be more of an energy of like conforming to the schedule and just working sort of regardless of how I was feeling. And this is really tricky because, of course, there is a temptation to swing the pendulum the total other way and work only according to feeling, right? And if you don't feel like working, you don't show up, and it's all about inspiration. And that's not it, right? That's not the new paradigm. The new paradigm is all about integration. So we're not throwing out the mind. We're not throwing out our calendar or our schedule. We're not throwing out our intentions, but we're integrating that with intuition, with feeling, with heart, with flow. So I'm constantly trying to work in this way that feels new and different, of being in the flow consistently, right? Of intending to show up every day, even when I don't feel like it, but to do so in a way that is aligned with flow. It's actually kind of tricky. For me, it is anyway. And I do find myself still swinging sometimes towards too much mind and force. Like there's an energy of force in that way of being, right? Where it's like, and I can work in that way. I can just push through and make myself do the things. But then what's created as a very different vibration, right? And I do also sometimes find myself swinging the other way, where it's like, I'm not feeling it. It doesn't feel right. And I'm sort of waiting for the inspiration. So what's that middle way? And I'm so often wary actually of speaking about like the balance, because I very often think these things aren't actually about balance. It's about integration. And I mean by that it's not like a little bit of flow, a little bit of force, right? Or a little bit of intuition, a little bit of mind. The ideal is actually all of both. So how can we integrate the mind and our schedule, let's say, with creativity and flow and intuition, so that both are fully present and operating together in harmony, rather than a little of this, a little of that, swinging this way, swinging that way, and just kind of striving to make the pendulum swing less big, right? So that's what I'm striving for in my own life and in my work. And I think that this is central to what a lot of us are moving through in the interest of really creating a more beautiful future, right? Like this way of moving through our own lives has everything to do with all the big issues unfolding, right? Like we could talk about protest movements and revolution and war and AI and politics and all these things that are important and that I do talk about a fair amount. But I really want to kind of come back to basics, come back to the body and the way we move through every moment of our everyday lives. And I do think that has everything to do with those bigger issues. And hopefully, over the course of this episode, I want to kind of slowly unpack a little bit why those are so related. So in some ways, it would almost be easier for me to approach this project from that old way of just pushing through, of just making myself record an episode every week, even if there wasn't anything I really particularly wanted to say, of consistently putting something out, whether it felt aligned or not. And, along with that kind of mentality goes sort of all the things you're supposed to do, right? Playing the algorithm and being on Instagram or whatever it is, right? Following all the rules. So in some ways that's easier because it's very familiar. That's actually my more comfortable way of being. But in my own personal path of healing and evolution, I'm really striving to rebalance, right? To reharmonize within and to reintegrate a more intuitive, heart-based way of being. And I'm still working on it. And I think that's mirrored by where many people are and where we are as a collective, where we're in this transition moment, right? I talk about this a lot. And in this moment of transition that in the span of human history is so short, but as we're living it out, it feels kind of long. It's several years. And in terms of the human collective, it's several decades. And you could even see it as several centuries. You could see the sort of first waves of the shift we're moving through now as beginning already more than 100 years ago. And it will continue on into the future for decades still. But if you're here listening to this, you're probably similar to me in this moment of working the transition in a very tangible, embodied way. And I think most transitions have a certain amount of turbulence within them. Like it's when we're shifting a pattern and we're sort of at the boundary of that shift, I think it's common for there to be kind of a wavering between the old familiar pattern and the new one, and a sort of refinement of how exactly that new one is going to manifest and be lived in, We get these moments where, these peak moments where we get it and we see, oh, this is it. But we have to then go back into a more ordinary way of being in order to integrate that new insight. And so I think it's very normal, and as it should be, that when we're in this moment of transition, of seeking to embody the new pattern, the new frequency, the new paradigm, that there's this sort of wobble almost where we kind of go back into this old way, back into the new way. And it's like our conscious mind, our ego mind is sort of catching up, right? And really integrating it. And so anyway, for me, it was really interesting to observe how I had this moment in September when I was like, yes, releasing perfectionism. And I was sort of on a roll where, episodes were coming a little more easily. And then the next week, there was a day where I had put in my calendar that I wanted to record. And I got up that day and I really didn't feel like recording. I just was feeling a little off. I'm human. I was just it wasn't even a bad day. It just wasn't a great day, And I wasn't really feeling like I had access to what I wanted to say. Usually with these episodes, I have some kind of idea. It feels often like sort of a download, like this insight that comes in around a theme or a topic or like it feels to me like an idea. It's like this single point that I can sense wants to be unpacked in all these different directions. But I usually go into the recording with sometimes more than one, but at least one of these sort of nuggets, like this insight that I can sense wants to be unpacked, and then in the recording, we sort of unpack it together. That's how it feels to me. And on that day, I couldn't quite access what that insight was. I had written it down, I had notes, but I wasn't feeling it. But I was like, okay, that's okay. I don't need to always feel it, right? Because we can't just show up only when we feel like it, right? This is the refinement of how do we operate in a way that is more in flow, more in intuition, more aligned with feeling. But that doesn't mean just doing what we feel like, right? It's a little bit tricky for me anyway. I think some people are much more natural in this. But I find it tricky in part because it was so instilled in me to operate in that other way of like separating out your feelings and just kind of pushing through. That's so deeply ingrained in me and in a lot of people, I think, right? And sort of the more deeply ingrained that is, the more tricky it is to find this new way of operating. Right? And so I was like, okay, no, I can't just operate according to how I feel, not really feeling it, but that's okay. I'm going to record anyway because, I want to create an episode this week and this is the time I'd set out to record. So I'm going to do it. And I felt off, I didn't feel like myself. I felt a little imbalanced. I didn't feel like I gave the topic what it deserved in a way. I felt like I was too much in my, even to some extent, triggers, to be totally honest. Like I was not as balanced and detached even as I would like to be when I record on topics that are a little bit more controversial, let's say. And I do sometimes feel very called to speak to more controversial topics, but I feel very called to do my best to do so in a way that is a little bit detached, a little bit objective, a little bit calm. And it's so funny because I know that may sound bad or wrong to a lot of people because there's this idea that like, no, passion is good and like these things are difficult and it's totally understandable to like whatever, have anger and pain around these topics. And it's important to speak about them from that place. And while to some extent I understand that, I don't actually think it's helpful, especially when we're in our triggers, to speak from that place. I do think some degree of detachment is really helpful when we want to speak to these more difficult topics. And by detachment, I don't mean no emotion or no feeling, but just like not being in our own personal hangups, and stories and triggers around it. But anyway, that day I was not. I am still a human. And, but even though I was not entirely happy with the recording, because I had made this statement, and I don't just mean because I'd made it publicly, but also like to myself, it's like I had this insight and then I turned it into a rule. The rule being, I'm releasing perfectionism. And I had this in my mind. So I was like, okay, it's not my favorite recording, but that's okay. I'm releasing perfectionism. The recordings don't have to be perfect. I'm just going to go with it. And then I worked so hard to try and make it work. I edited the recording. I recorded extra content to weave into it. And then I shared it with my paying subscribers, but I was so uncomfortable. I just didn't like it. And even then, I unpublished it and then edited it again. I did another edit, and I edited also the write-up to it, and then I published it again, and I still didn't like it. I just didn't like the whole thing, even though I worked so hard, extra hard on it, because I was trying to make it better. I was trying to fix this recording that I didn't love to begin with. And I was like, no, I'm releasing perfectionism. But I was haunted by this episode. I hated it. And I was just so uncomfortable with it being out there on my platform, I couldn't shake it. And then finally I was like, okay, I have to honor this feeling. And yes, I'm releasing perfectionism, but that doesn't mean not caring about this sense that it's not right? So I unpublished it. I mean, some of you probably listened to this episode. It was the Hands of the King episode. And I don't know, some of you are probably thinking it was fine. Maybe not everyone, because it's really interesting actually how the number of views and opens has dropped off significantly since that episode, which is fine. That's just part of, creating and sharing. And so I finally unpublished it, and I just feel so much better not having it out there, even though a part of me is a little even embarrassed that people listen to that episode that I just didn't like. I just don't like it. And I really think this for me was a way of refining what exactly do I mean by releasing perfectionism? Because it can't mean just not caring, right? It can't mean just ignoring that sense within me of I don't like it, or it's off, or there was something sort of nagging at me. It's a little hard to put in words because it was this energetic thing. I felt haunted. I felt haunted by that episode. Even the imagery, the hands of the king. I published it sometime in October, and then I kept seeing in Addams Family, the hand, what's it called? The thing? I think it's just thing, not the thing. But anyway, I kept imagining because, this moment we're moving through, of course, is about no kings, obviously. And my whole point, the point I was trying to make in that episode, is that in so many ways, the left-right binary just plays into the current structures of power and maintaining them, right? Divide and conquer. We know this. But because the whole point is to take our power back, I kept seeing the hands as cut off from the king as these two things. And I was haunted. I was haunted by these thing hands. Anyway. Okay, I'm getting a little sidetracked from what I really want to talk about. But the point is, there's this refinement around what does it mean to release perfectionism and how to still stay in alignment with intuition. How to operate intuitively, but yet still show up consistently, ideally. But I think there's also something about, for me, redefining actually what consistency means, because there was a moment when I was really struggling with I can't do a podcast unless I do it every week, which obviously isn't true. Some of my favorite podcasts don't publish weekly. Some of them publish monthly. Some of them publish just kind of randomly. And I know that a lot of this is just like all the pressure. And there's like a lot of psychic pressure and projections as well, like around how people should operate, and that it needs to be at a certain frequency, and it needs to be like every week or twice a week or at least every 2 weeks or whatever it is, right? And particularly with like algorithms and Substack at one point was sort of like a safe harbor for people wanting to create in a different way, but they're of course bringing about more and more sort of like features and algorithms and things that like create this pressure on creators to create in a very particular way. And we all like to think we're immune to that, and I do think there are a lot of things we can do to detach from those kinds of pressures. But at the end of the day, none of us are totally immune from that. I mean, it's supposed to operate subliminally on us, and it does. So there is this sort of pressure to create in a very particular way that feels to me at odds with my authentic flow and intuitive mode, which again is not about just showing up when I feel like it. So I think it was really interesting that I had this like whole period where I like created this recording that I didn't like, and then I tried so hard to save it, put it out there, was uncomfortable with it, finally unpublished it. But it's teaching me so much. It's really helping me to remember to honor my own sense that can't fully be put into words around what I want to share and what I don't want to share. And sort of my own standards in a way, which is too simple a way to say what I really want to say. For me, one thing that I'm trying, and I'm still very much in the midst of experimenting with this, but I think what works best for me is when I'm very clear on my intentions, and then I release control over how those intentions will be fulfilled. And to me, that is what I think is the or like a way of thinking about this integration of intuition and structure, let's say, because it's like operating according to intuition instead of like goals or a rigid schedule. That's, I think, a key difference. And of course, some things are scheduled, right? Like, I do readings and I always show up for my readings, just as one example, right? Sometimes, we have to show up at a certain time and place. But in terms of recording these episodes, I have the luxury of being able to do that, with some flexibility. And I would like to do it more consistently, even if my definition of consistency does not necessarily mean every week or on any kind of rigid schedule. But if I can hold the intention of a certain pacing and then release control over exactly how that will happen or when it will happen, to me, that's a way of finding this sort of integration so that I can still be in my intuitive flow, even while having like agency and intention around what I create. I hope this is making sense. It's like allowing some room in for collaborating and co-creating with the universe, with my guides, with you all, so that it's not just like directives, like it's not just following rules, following a script, doing what I'm supposed to do or whatever, right? Because there's no room for creativity or play or co-creation or intuition when we're operating in that mode, right? When we're operating in a purely left hemispheric mode, let's say, right? So all these issues that we've been talking about are all interrelated, right? Like I'm not creating this episode on gender, but of course that's related, right? And like, me, if you're new here, hello, welcome. But, most of you know me and know that something I'm really interested in, and one of the ways that I think we might conceive of this sort of revolutionary moment between paradigms is through the lens of gender. And I mean gender in a metaphysical sense of two inherently different energetic modes of being that all of creation embody or show up as. And how I believe that this critical moment that humanity finds itself in, where, some people call it the polycrisis, right? Where we're facing all these issues from all sides. I think one way we can conceive of that is as a programmed way of operating that humanity has been embedded in for millennia, where these two different energetic modes have been seen to be at odds with one another. They've been at war with one another. The left hemispheric mode has been not just suppressing and repressing and devaluing the right hemispheric mode, which is more intuitive, more flowing, more relational, more holistic, but it even has gone so far as denying even the existence of that way of thinking and being and operating. Right? The mind in its quote unquote logic can deny even the existence of intuition, of the infinite, ineffable, present moment, right? Our subjective reality, our experience of being, of this exact moment in time and place that has never been before and will never be again. We can see how the mind in its convoluted theories can deny the existence of that, of what is obviously real, more real than anything else, this present moment, right? There's all kinds of theories over like what is really real. Consciousness isn't real. It's an epiphenomenon. That kind of thinking, right? That literally seeks to deny presence. So these two modes of being, these two energetic modes that we can call the feminine and the masculine, we can call the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, we can call, active and receptive or yin and yang, that are meant to be in a dance, in relation with one another, in a co-creative, respectful, interactive relationship through which all that is created. But there's been this intense distortion programmed into humanity for millennia that has its source at this metaphysical level, right? Where these two modes have been turned against one another. And there's deep, deep wounding around this. And there's wounding in the feminine collective, and there's wounding in the masculine collective. And so, I want to talk about something so simple and so immediate, which is how to live in an intuitive way. But to my mind, it's related to these really big, complex, vast issues. And so no wonder it's tricky. No wonder we have to try and get it wrong sometimes and then try again and refine the process. Right? Because we're in this moment of transition, of transitioning out of a way of being that has been so deeply instilled in us for literal millennia. So if it takes a few years, let's give ourselves a little bit of grace, right? I do think that intention is really a key here. So, feel into, for example, the energetics of a goal versus an intention, and feel into the energetics of a rigid schedule versus a flexible one, let's say, one that allows for some degree of flow and intuition. Because intuition it's a way of harnessing the co-creative relational potential inherent in how we navigate the flow of these two different energetics. An intention is like harnessing the mental aspect as the archetype of the magician who is not in denial of magic and infinity, right? Who's not in denial of intuition and the miraculous, let's say, right? To be a magician or to stand in that archetype is already to be intending to co-create with all that is, not to presume that the mental mode does it all by itself in a step-by-step procedural, purely mental way, right? Because it's to say, this is the vision, this is the intention, this is the frequency that I want to create. And then it's to release attachment to the specific outcome and to how exactly it shall come to pass. It's to make space for divine orchestration rather than thinking that it's all up to oneself to make it happen, to force it through. It's quite funny if you think about it, that the mind ever thinks that it could grasp all of reality or be in charge of everything or have it all figured out or come to some perfect theory of everything. Because isn't it kind of obvious that a theory, for example, is a theory of something that's much vaster and more complex than the specific theory could ever identify? Isn't it obvious that the mind is describing something that can never be fully put into words? Or theories, or logic, or math even? And I love logic. I love math. I do think that math is a fundamental structural aspect of reality. So again, I'm not denying any of these things. But I love the idea of intention as a way of honoring the mind, right? Of honoring the left-hemispheric mode, but in a way that allows space for flow, for intuition, for creativity, for collaboration, for all the unseen forces and all that is unknown. We can't possibly know everything. We don't know all the variables. We don't know all the possibilities. The right amount of space for flow and play and improvisation, you could even say, is what allows for creativity. It's what allows for anything new. So when we speak about intuition, I don't think it's helpful if we go fully into an intuitive feeling-based mode that then denies the mental or the logical or the structural aspects of reality. So it's not just do whatever you want, right? Or just do what you feel like doing. And I do think this is something that we learn through doing it. We can talk about it all day, but it's trying it and getting it wrong and trying it again and refining and refining and refining. How to be in flow. How to be in the flow of our own life. It's strange that that's difficult, Like, I've been having this conversation with a friend of mine around how hilarious it is that humans forget to breathe. Like, are there any other animals that forget to breathe? I don't think so. And I mean, it's similarly kind of funny that we have forgotten to a large extent how to be in the flow of our own lives. I often think about this for myself when I think about cleaning my house, because when I have the time, like I really love if I have the time to be able to take a full day and to sort of have in mind the things I want to do. Okay, I want to do the laundry. I've got to dust and I've got to vacuum and clean the bathroom and so on, right? I have kind of this list of all the things that I want to get done. But I love, it's funny how much I love this, but I really love the experience of just like putting on some music or listening to something and just sort of going about those tasks without a strict schedule or order, of kind of like puttering around my apartment and just doing whatever I feel called to do in that moment. Like, it's a very sort of intuitive process. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like, if I were to write down the steps and the order, it'd be like, oh, I like water the plants, but I only half water them. And then I go to the kitchen and then I do this. And then it's like, doesn't really make a lot of logical sense. But it is so enjoyable to be in that flow of just like puttering in my apartment and just getting those things done in the order that feels correct in the moment, right? Of being in a creative flow. I know it's funny that I like find it most easy to harness my own creative flow when I'm cleaning. Yeah, leave it to someone with a bunch of Virgo placements. But I think it's easier for me to find that flow when I'm cleaning because it's like such low stakes. It's not my work. I don't share it publicly. I'm not trying to be creative when I clean my house. I'm not trying to be in the flow, right? There's no pressure around it. So it's a really easy, as long as I have the time, right? When we're feeling rushed, that definitely messes up the flow. I'm bringing this up because I think it can be helpful to try to find an example in our own lives where, because for most of us, there's often at least one area of our life where it's more easy to find that flow, to find the intuitive flow, where we're still doing what needs to be done or what we have intended to do, but without that kind of rigid pressure and strict order, And so if you can find in your own life a sort of visceral example like that, I think that's useful in almost like reverse engineering. How do I access that flow in that experience? And what can I learn from that in terms of the other areas of my life where it may be a little bit more difficult to embody that flow state, that creative, intuitive way of being and operating? And to me, that feels like luxury. Like, to me, that's wealth. That is abundance. That sense of being in the flow, even if it's when I'm cleaning my house, that is one of the best feelings to me. I just love that feeling, being in the flow of my own life, right? Without grasping, without forcing, without controlling, right? Control is such a big piece of this. But not release intention, right? We keep intention and then we release control. And I really, isn't this so relevant to, world politics? Because I think the way that populations are sort of tricked into agreeing to repressive policies is through the fear of losing control. I mean, fear in general, right? But there's this ideology around we have to control XYZ, right? Whatever it is. And anything can be used, right? We have to control the climate. We have to control immigration. We have to control terrorism. We have to control the virus, right? We have to control, violence. We have to control, fill in the blank. And then almost anything can be justified in the name of that. But I want to come back to the more personal layer of this and how important it is to release control. But again, the phrasing is tricky because that doesn't mean just not caring or having no agency or not being in charge of one's own life, right? There is something about taking responsibility for one's own life, acknowledging one's autonomy and agency and acting in an intentional way, but without this tight grip of controlling everything, right? But I think the mind, left to its own devices, has this belief that if it releases control, chaos will ensue, And there is something about trusting the flow, trusting life, trusting the universe, trusting God, however you want to put it, right? Because the mind, which is often coming from a place of ego, and no hate to the ego is a necessary psychological structure, right? But it is not the entirety of who we are. And when we mistakenly believe it's the entirety of who we are, we get ourselves into a lot of trouble, right? And this is one of those troubles where from the ego mind place, this idea that, we can control every single detail and that's what we ought to strive for. I mean, I almost think that kind of mentality leads to all the worst things in the world. But I'm trying to keep this a little more local, a little more personal. And I think we can all relate to that. I think we can all think of examples in our own life where when we enter into that more kind of controlling mindset, it's not really a good thing, is it? And when we can let go a little, it's not like everything goes downhill. It actually just allows a little bit of space for creativity, for play, for flow, for collaboration, right? Now, particularly if our intention is to be aligned with our own higher self and soul path, which is one of my primary intentions always. Which is not to say I never get it wrong, obviously, right? But that's one of my deepest intentions in this life is to be constantly finding alignment with my higher self, with my soul path, in collaboration with my guides, with all that is, right? And if that's an intention, then we can operate in this way that is guided by higher aspects, right? That are not just ego-based, that are not just in fear, right? So much of the ego is so often in fear. And so much of this way of being in the mind that we've been talking about, being in the mind in a way that's disconnected from, we could even say God, right? Like this disconnected left hemispheric mode that can go so far as even denying the right hemisphere or the vastness of reality. We could actually understand it in the context of a denial of God, a denial of the spiritual realm, a denial of spirituality. And if you don't resonate with the term God, then use your own terminology, right? You could say a denial of source, a denial of the vastness of all that is and the great mystery of life, right? It could be even a denial of our ancestors or angels or guides or soul, even denial of soul. And, part of me wants to make that make sense to someone who's operating in that mode. It's so funny. This is like a block I come up against over and over in my work, where a part of me wants to explain it to someone who's still in that way of operating. But it's actually impossible, because in that way of operating, the mind can just explain all that away. It can concoct this fabricated reality that is purely mental, and it can kind of exist in that space. Like, it doesn't need to believe anything else. And I kind of think that's the allure of simulation theory, for example, or even the idea that AI could be creative or that it will replace all our jobs. Like, these kinds of ways of thinking stem exactly from that place of the purely mental mode that is cut off from, let's just say, God. And so it is this block I have, and I'm trying to see that it's sort of futile to try to make it make sense from that perspective. And that's actually, in a way, one of the things I really didn't like about that episode is that it felt like I was sort of facing backwards and talking about the past and what's wrong and, the ways of thinking and being that don't work. Whereas I think what's really needed is to turn around and face the future, to keep our sight fixed on what we're creating, on what we desire, on what we intend. Because it just saps our energy, our vital force, when we're attending to all the things that are wrong, to, all the people that are doing it in the wrong way. We need our energy to create the future, right? That's created in the present moment. And if our present moment is occupied by considering the past, then we're only creating more of the same. So the more we can detach from what's going wrong and put our energy into being in a different way and creating what we desire and co-creating with other beautiful souls in a playful, loving way, right? That's how we create a more beautiful future. But it's almost like there's like a train wreck happening before our eyes, and it's like very tempting to keep fixated on it, And it's logical, right? From that mental place, it's logical to look at all the things that are going wrong, right? And to talk about it and analyze it and critique it. And I do think critique is necessary. Like, I think there is this sort of other pendulum swing of being like, we attend to the future. We don't need critique or analysis of how it has been and how it is. But if there's no critique, if there's no analysis, then we very likely will recreate certain structural patterns because these patterns are so deeply embedded in the human psyche. For most humans, anyway. It's not like an inherently human thing, but most of us have been colonized in this way. Let's put it that way. And so if there's no analysis, we very likely won't get to the root of these like structural, psychological, metaphysical issues, and we will recreate them. That's one of the reasons why we see so many issues in even spiritual realms and activist realms, right? Because people want to do the right thing and they want to do good and they put all their energy into these efforts, but they haven't done that deep inner work of healing, at the source, right? And then so we recreate the same dynamics under the guise of doing something new or spiritual or revolutionary, right? So, all to say, there's a place for analysis and critique, but then we must put our energy into what are we creating? And we're creating in every single moment, whether we intend to or not, right? It's the frequency that we inhabit in the present that creates the future. So this was a roundabout way of saying that I'm so tempted to try and make this make more sense to someone who's in that purely mental mode. But I think that's ultimately rather futile because people get out of that mode through all kinds of different ways, but I don't think it's usually through logic. I mean, maybe there's a place for that. Like there was in my own journey. And I think that's why I sort of go back there because, I was certainly stuck in that very like mental, logical mode. And it was really helpful for me to read like spiritual texts or philosophical texts that sort of showed my mind that there was a different way of being and that its philosophy and mindset was actually not as logical and coherent as it thought it was. But it has to be through a logic that shows that even in a logical system, there has to be space for the unknown, the mystery, the miraculous, the spiritual. Like there has to be some kind of break or leap out of that way of being to acknowledge the vaster reality, right? So if it is a logical process that gets us out of it, it's a logical process that shows the limits of logic, the limits of the mind, right? And this has been a really important theme in the history of philosophy, particularly in the last couple hundred years, right? Of showing in a logical way that logic itself is limited, right? Showing in a mental way that the mind itself has limits. And oftentimes, it's not just through logic, but through very personal, visceral experience, right? So while philosophy was really helpful for me, I was only inspired towards that quest, let's say, because I'd had very real experiences that showed me firsthand that the way I thought the world worked wasn't accurate. And then I went and tried to make sense of it. Okay, so it's so funny because I'm trying to say I don't want to get stuck on trying to make it make sense. And I'm trying to say I want to be able to talk about God and the spiritual realm, even though I don't know how to give an argument for that. But it's like, I also know that most of you listening don't need that, right? Like, it's so funny. I keep coming up against this sort of other issue with this project, which is around like, who am I actually speaking to? And I think sometimes I get a little stuck in kind of trying to speak to everyone, or trying to speak to every perspective, or trying to speak to skeptics or non-believers, when why? Like, I don't actually think that's who most of you are. And it's helpful for me to like think of those of you who I know, or those of you who I've worked with, who've come to me for readings, and like, let me just take a moment to say that you guys are amazing. I am constantly astounded by just the incredible people who come to me for readings, or who I encounter through my work in different ways. And I just feel so honored, truly, truly honored to work with you, with all of you, like all of you who've ever had a reading with me. Like, anytime I have a moment of doubting myself or like questioning what I'm doing, I just think to my clients and how incredible you are. Like, just creative, beautiful, loving, intentional, intelligent people, truly. And it's just, I just feel so blessed, honestly. I know I'm getting gushy, but just let me gush for a moment. And so when I remember who you actually are, right? Those of you who I've met, and presumably those of you who listen to this who I haven't met, are probably equally amazing human beings. Why would you be listening to this if you didn't believe in spirituality, or, if you were some kind of like, I don't know, right-wing fascist or whatever, right? Like, so I'm trying to stop feeling like I need to speak to those people. And I think that will help me to find a little bit more of this flow that I'm seeking if I remember who I'm actually speaking to. Okay, so that was kind of an aside. What I'm trying to get to here is that I think when we allow this more intuitive mode, when we allow for this collaboration between the mind and the intuition, let's say, with the intention of aligning with our highest self, our soul path, however you want to put it, I think that is precisely what makes space for something higher, let's say, to flow through. One way of describing the spiritual path, and I think particularly in this moment, I do think there's sort of a collective wave around this particular learning, which is, I think a lot of us are actively merging. I was going to say seeking to merge, but I think we're actually in the process of doing it, of merging our higher self. I don't always like that terminology of higher, but I'm going to use it because I think most people know what I mean by that terminology, right? But we are actively merging our higher self with our ego self, right? So there are very unhealthy expressions of ego, right? We do the shadow work, we heal that, but we still need like an ego structure. It's just a psychological structure. It's like the mind's conception of who we are, right? And the mind has limits, right? We know that. So the mind's conception of who we are, the ego self, right? Which is, and it's not purely a conception. It's like a set of patterns and conditionings and assumptions and beliefs, right? And then there's this higher aspect of us, the unconditioned aspect, right? That has no fear because it's not conditioned by biology and by culture and by social programming and all of that, right? So it's higher in that respect, right? That it's sort of more rooted in the spiritual realm. And for much of the spiritual journey, we're seeking to reach out to that aspect of it, to receive insight and guidance from that aspect. And, in collaboration with guides and God and etc. But I think at a certain point we realize, okay, it's no longer just about seeking communication with this part of me, but actually merging these two parts, merging my, regular human ego with my higher self. We're actually inviting the soul more fully into the body. And this is so integrative and healing, right? Because no longer is spirituality about this split where we have to disconnect from the body and go up into the spiritual realm. And it's even that can sometimes serve as a form of dissociation, right? It can even be a trauma response. Okay, that's a whole other topic, right? But when we can actually draw down the spiritual realm into the body, into our everyday life, into our guts, right? Not just the head, but our guts, our feet, our roots. That's mastery. In my mind, that's the I was going to say goal, but that's funny to put it in that terminology. But I think that's where a lot of us are on our spiritual journey right now, where we're really seeking that deeper integration. There's a really loud sound outside. I hope it's not too disturbing to the recording. But I think that this idea of integrating the intuitive mode allows for more of that aspect of us to come into the picture, right? Because that aspect, let's say the higher self, it doesn't operate in this rigid mental way. It operates according to the moment, the precise moment, which can never be fully anticipated or spelled out or defined. Certainly not in advance, but even in the moment or even after the fact, we can never fully spell it all out. And the ego wants to often, right? But the higher self, let's say, is infinitely flexible and wise and knows without needing to conceive it mentally, right? It's just direct access, gnosis, right? It knows what is appropriate and needed in the moment. I think music is another beautiful metaphor here where, there's a place for learning our scales and practicing and trying really hard and, working at it. But then in a performance with musicians who've been doing it for a long time and are able to not just follow the steps, not just read the music and, do it right according to the mind, but open up to that intuitive flow in collaboration with all that is and with the other musicians present, of course. That's when magic happens, right? Isn't that such a beautiful moment when you're, listening to music, when you're at some kind of performance and you can just something shifts and there's this incredible harmony. It's like the words aren't adequate, right? Harmony sounds like such a boring word. Yes, of course, we're looking for harmony in music, right? But that harmonious play of, different musicians collaborating together, there's something divine and mystical that can happen. And I want to say that allowing that through, allowing space for our higher self to operate, allowing space for God, let's say, I think is precisely what is most needed in this moment in our personal lives, but politically too. And I don't want to get too into this because I've already been recording for an hour and 40 minutes. And so, this might be a future episode to go really deeply into this, but you can see all of these political ideas being proposed right now and sort of certain trajectories in motion around everything like AI and digital currency and digital ID and war, like all of it, everything that's kind of being rolled out. The current trajectory is operating in this ideology of pure mentality, where there is no space for everything we've been talking about today, for intuition, for creativity, for soul, for God. And particularly for our own individual relationship with our own knowing. I really do think that one way of summing up everything that's playing out politically right now is that there is an attempt to deny the possibility of our own connectedness to our own knowing and to disrupt it or prevent it. Right? There's this pull to merge with the hive mind. And it'll be distorted in the way of describing it as community or the collective, right? So we have to be careful around ideology that talks about what's good for the group because, yes, like as spiritual beings, that's one of our primary concerns, right? What is good for others? What is good for humanity? What is good for the earth? What is good for all beings everywhere in every realm? That's one of my primary intentions, and I think that's so key spiritually is to align with not just what's in our own best interest, but what's in the best interest of all. And, we've been told that it's an either or. Right? We've been conditioned with a zero-sum ideology. What's good for me is not good for others. What's good for others is not good for me. It's a lie. Right? What we ought to be seeking is that intersection point between what's best for me and what's best for all. And that can only be the truth. And we are faced with that so clearly right now, right? The climate crisis is the perfect example where caring about the earth is good for all of us. If we keep going down the road we're going down, it's bad for all of us, even though the reason we're going down that road is because there's this ideology of but I have to take care of me and my own. Okay, another bit of a sidetrack. There's so much more we could say about that, but coming back to the point I'm trying to make, which is that we can see this pull into these ideologies that tell us that what's good for the community is precisely to deny our own knowing. Okay, and it's not put in those terms, but but that's at the heart of so many things that are being proposed and rolled out right now. Right, we have to deny our own selfhood because we have to care about others. But actually, the truth is that to care about others requires that we align with our own higher self and with God. Or source or universe or however you want to put it, right? That's what I mean when I say God. When I say God, I mean all that is. I mean the divine. And when I talk about higher self, I mean that aspect of us that is inherently in alignment with God, that is inherently in alignment with all that is, with all beings everywhere, and is always seeking what is best for that, for all. And that knows that what is best for all is best for ourselves and vice versa. So cultivating this relationship with the divine, with our higher self, is the most important thing we can be doing right now. It's not about ignoring what's going on in the world. It's actually precisely in service to humanity and Earth. So can you see how technocracy and this sort of ultra surveillance kind of structure and like the Internet of Things, right? Like collecting more and more and more data and programmable money and like giving more tasks to AI and like controlling the flows of populations more strictly, and like just this increasing control over human life and human decisions, like even to the extreme point of, for example, something like Neuralink, which proposes to not just read our brainwaves, but actually write to the brain, meaning literally impact our brain, what we think and feel. That's the extreme version, but a similar sort of mentality exists in all of these ideas. Can you see how all of that works to deny our agency and our own direct relationship with God? It denies our own knowing. It seeks to embed us more deeply in the machine, right? In this structure of top-down control, of centralized authority, all in the name of all kinds of great things, right? Safety, security, protecting the earth, managing resource use, whatever. All kinds of wonderful things will be used as the excuse to deny us of our own selfhood. And selfhood with a capital S, right, which is not ego-based, but which is our way of being in alignment with our own highest self, with God, with all that is. That's the only hope, truly, for the future of humanity. And by future of humanity, I mean like the possibility that there even will be a future of humanity actually depends on that. The future of humanity, the very existence of humanity, requires that we are connected with God, to put it simply. And all of these proposals and the ideology around it seeks precisely to deny us of that. It seeks to separate us from our connection to the divine, and it seeks to deny our own agency and autonomy, right? It seeks to pull us into the Borg, right? The hive mind, the Internet of Things, the Internet of People, whatever. The surveillance economy, the technocratic state, perfect control, right? The technocratic state is the demonic fantasy of the mind, of the left hemisphere, in complete detachment from and denial of the right hemisphere, the intuitive mode, the infinite, ineffable nature of reality in this present moment, right? Technocracy is the deluded fantasy of that form of operating, right? It's the deluded fantasy of the ego mind, actually, but on a global scale, that relies on ideology, right? None of this would be possible if it weren't for ideology and propaganda and programming. So this is the source of our power, right? It begins in the mind and heart and body. And yeah, we may have to, more actively fight it in more visceral ways, but it begins internally with something as simple as seeking to live our lives with more creative, intuitive flow. Okay. As always, I love to hear from you. If you feel shy and you don't want to comment publicly, you're always welcome to email me. I do just want to invite your comments and your thoughts and your feedback, and I would love to know if this is landing and if you are working with this as well. I suspect that a lot of you are working with finding this balance between the mind and intuition, and with finding a more harmonious creative flow in your own lives, in your everyday lives. And so I would love to hear from you. I would love to, hear your personal experiences and examples of how this is playing out in your life. Okay, I'm sending so much love to you all. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your time and your energy. So thank you. And until next time, take care. For more information, for more content, head on over to Substack. The link is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Until next time, take care.